Lesson 6.3 is focusing on simplest form. We talked a little bit about simplest form last lesson. Let's go ahead and dive into simplest form and talk a little bit more about what it is. So simplest form. A fraction is in its simplest form when the only factor the numerator and denominator have in common are the number 1. You can simplify a fraction to its simplest form by dividing by common factors. So what we want to do is we want to list factors that these numbers have in common. A hint, something that can help us, if both numbers are even, we know that they're both going to have factors of 2, or they're both going to be divisible by 2. This is a really good way for us to just jump off and start doing some division. If both are even, we can divide by 2. So let's take a look at these numbers here that we have. We have the number 4 and 8 in our fraction 4/8. Both of these numbers are even, so both of them are going to have factors of 2. So we can divide both 4 and 8 by 2 to simplify this. So let's go ahead and do that. Now when I divide 4 divided by 2, I get 2, and then 8 divided by 2 gets me 4. Now here we have two more even numbers. The number 2 and the number 4 are both even, so they both have factors of 2. 1 times 2 gets me 2, and 2 times 2 gets me 4. So I can go ahead and simplify this even further by dividing by 2. And when I do that, I'm left with 1/2. Now, here are some hints for us, some things that are going to help us identify if something's in simplest form. The first hint is a 1 in the numerator. If there's a 1 in the numerator, or the number on top, then that number is in the simplest form. There's no way that we can simplify that number anymore, or that fraction anymore. So if it has a 1 in the numerator, it's already in the simplest form. The second hint is if the numerator and the denominator are consecutive numbers, then the fraction's in its simplest form. So that means if we have 1/2, if we have something like 2/3, or if we have 4/5, or if we have 16/17, whatever it is, as long as those numbers in the fraction are numerically consecutive. That means one number and then the next number. So 1 and then 2, 2 and then 3, 4 and then 5, 16 and 17. If you have two numbers that are consecutive in the numerator and then in the denominator, then that fraction is in the simplest form. And the last hint is if the denominator is prime, then your fraction is in the simplest form. Now if it's the numerator that's prime, it's not necessarily in the simplest form. For example, 5 is a prime number. But if we looked at a fraction 5/15, we could simplify this further by dividing by 5. So this would not be the simplest form. Instead, 1/5 would be the simplest form, and then this meets 2 of our criteria. But let's say you had a fraction like 4/11. 11 is a prime number. Or if you had a fraction like 6/19, 19 is a prime number. Maybe you even had something like 7/23. Well, 23 is a prime number. So if you have a prime number in the denominator, then these numbers, or these fractions rather, are in the simplest form. These 3 hints can really help us figure out if numbers are in simplest form or not. Now, the surefire way to tell if numbers are in the simplest form is if the only factor that they have in common is the factor of 1, then we're for sure know that these factors, or these fractions, are in their simplest form. Let's go ahead and take a look at some fractions, and we're going to simplify them to their simplest form. Now, if we take a look at 6/8 to begin with, both of these numbers are even. And if two fractions have, or a fraction has a numerator and a denominator that are both even, it's definitely not in the simplest form, because both of those even numbers have the number 2 in common as a factor. So we can go ahead and always start off by dividing by 2. If you can think of a larger number to divide into them, you may absolutely do that, but 2 is always a really good starting point. So if we go ahead and we divide, 6 divided by 2 gets me 3, and 4 divided by 2 gets, or 8 divided by 2 gets me 4. And if we look at this fraction now, we have numbers that are consecutive. So 3 and then 4 follows it directly behind. So when we have two numbers that are consecutive, we know that this is in the simplest form. So 3/4 is equivalent to 6/8, and 3/4 is in the simplest form. Let's take a look at 9/12. What do 9 and 12 have in common? Well, are both of these numbers prime numbers? They are not. 9 is not a prime number, nor is 12. So what are some factors that they have in common? We can always start by looking to see if they're both even. They are not. So they don't have 2 in common. So my next question to myself would be, do they have 3 in common? Is 9 divisible by 3? It is. How about 12? It also is divisible by 3. So if I find that 2 numbers are divisible by 3, I can divide by 3. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to divide these numbers by 3. 9 divided by 3 gets me 3, and 12 divided by 3 gets me 4. So I, again, have 2 numbers that are consecutive, 3 and then 4. So this fraction is in the simplest form. Now, if we look up, we have 3/4 and 3/4. If 9/12 is equivalent to 3/4 and 6/8 is equivalent to 3/4, let me ask you this question. Is 6/8 equivalent to 9/12? What do you think? They are, in fact, equivalent. If they both have 3/4 in common, then they are both going to be equivalent to each other. I could figure out if these are equivalent to each other by simplifying them. So I already did that here, and I found that they both simplify to 3/4. You can also find if 2 fractions are equivalent to each other by finding common denominators, and we're going to do that next lesson. All right. I want you to go ahead and simplify these 2 fractions. You have 6/10 and you have 2/8. What are these fractions in simplest form? Well, both 6 and 10 are even numbers, so they're both going to be divisible by 2. So I'm going to start off by dividing by 2. 6 divided by 2 gets me 3, and 10 divided by 2 gets me 5. Now, one of the things I mentioned earlier in our tips is if the denominator is a prime number, then the fraction is in simplest form. Let's take a look at this fraction. The number 5 is a prime number, and it's in our denominator. So because our denominator is prime, then 3/5 is in its simplest form. We are all done there. 3 and 5 have nothing in common other than 1. Both 3 and 5 are actually prime numbers. All right, 2/8. If I divide, both of these are even numbers, so I'm going to divide both of them by 2, and I end up with 1/4. One of the things that was mentioned in your tips is if there is a 1 in the numerator, then this fraction is in simplest form. All right. Go ahead and simplify these 2 fractions, 10/20 and 8/12. Let's go ahead and start with 10/20. I notice that both of these are even, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to divide by 2. When I do that, I get 5/10. Now, I might think to myself that I'm all done, but I really need to go through all of my steps to identify if I'm all done. Do 5 and 10 have anything else in common? They do. They have 5 in common. So now I need to go and I need to divide by 5. Notice how this fraction didn't meet any of our criteria. It didn't have a 1 in its numerator. It did not have 2 numbers that were consecutive, and it didn't have a prime number in the denominator. So if we go through all 3 of those checks, it's a really good idea that we go back and look at our fractions again. So let's go ahead and we can divide by 5, and when we do that, we're left with 1/2. Now this does meet our criteria. Notice how it has a 1 in the numerator and it has 2 numbers that are consecutive. How about if we divided a different way? This wasn't the only way that we could simplify this to 1/2. What else do 10 and 20 have in common? Couldn't we divide by 10? Well, 10 times 1 equals 10 and 10 times 2 equals 20, so of course I could. So if I divide both of these by 10, I can actually skip a step. I don't have to do 2 steps, I can do 1. 10 divided by 10 gets me 1, and 20 divided by 10 gets me 2, and this ends up with the same results. Now if you didn't see that you could divide by 10, not a problem. You can still solve this problem. Go ahead and look at 8/12. Both of these are even, so I'm going to divide by 2 to start with, and I end up with 4/6. Both of my numbers are even again, so I can divide again by 2, and then I end up with 2/3. Notice how I have consecutive numbers, so this tells me it's in the simplest form. What's another way that I could do this, though, with 8/12? Something else that 8 and 12 have in common, other than the fact that they're both even, is they're both divisible by 4. So I could divide my numerator and denominator by 4, and I would end up with 2/3 as well. It's just another way that we can work these problems out. All right, the last thing that I want you to do is I want you to take a look at all of these fractions here, and there are quite a few of them on here. And I want you to identify which of these fractions are in the simplest form. Use those tips that we talked about at the very, very beginning. If it has a 1 in the numerator, if it has 2 consecutive numbers, and if it has the denominator that is prime, then it's going to be in the simplest form. Go ahead and write those down. What are the fractions that are in the simplest form? If we look at these fractions, those are the types of things I'm going to look for. I'm going to look for my 1s in my numerator. So I see 1 here, and 1 here. Then I'm going to go through and I'm going to look for maybe denominators that are prime. 10 is not 12. Nope. I don't see any denominators that are prime other than this one right here. And then this one also shows me consecutive numbers. Those are all of my fractions that are in the simplest form. Using those 3 little tips can really help me identify which fractions are in simplest form. All of these other fractions can be simplified. So if you'd like a little bit of extra credit on your homework tonight, go ahead and take these fractions that have not yet been simplified, write them down on a sheet of paper and simplify them and turn them in the morning, and you might get a treat. Everybody else, this is all we have for our lesson on simplifying fractions. Again, it's really important that we divide by the same thing for our numerator and denominator, and that's dividing by a common factor. I'll see you tomorrow when we talk about common denominators.